about what a student knows and can do in the language. And in the grand scheme of things, they don't tell us very much, but we do use them. And so we put points into the grade book for homework, and we put points in, we collect it. We collect the classwork and the practice, and we look it over and we say, ooh, you did good, you get all the points. Ooh, you had some trouble, you get 7 out of 10 points. Oops, it actually skipped one of my slides. Okay then. So actually, what if our grade was something else? What if the grade was an accurate representation of what students know and can do in the language in culturally appropriate ways in and out of the classroom? In other words, what if points for homework didn't exist? What if there weren't points for classwork in the traditional sense? And what if there was no extra credit? Well, to answer that, let's go back a bit and let's think about why. Why do we give grades? And if you ask most educators, they will say, I actually give grades to communicate information to students and parents about how well the students can do with the material they've learned. That is the purpose of giving grades. We run into a problem with that premise when we think about our students, though, because our students know how to get grades without, in fact, actually having the proficiency that the grade might indicate. How do they do that? They do all of the things that get them the points. They do the homework, they do the classwork, they do the extra credit, they get all of the points for it. Actually, we don't even know if they do some of it, but they do turn it in, and then they get the points for it. So they do all of the things that they need to do, and the students evaluate all those things, and the teachers evaluate all those things and assess points for them. Put it all in the grade book, and they can end up with a grade that is not just what they know and can do. And we run into another problem. When we have students getting grades for their homework, I'm not sure it's even practice anymore. If they're getting points off for getting mistakes on their homework, is it practice or is it a test? And if we are evaluating their homework, when do they have a chance to make mistakes without those mistakes affecting their grade? When do they have a chance to fail in their period of learning? We all say we value failure and that students need to learn how to progress through failure. When in our grading systems that are based on points can students fail enough times to ultimately become the master? When can they struggle and go through that period of struggle, which is also known as learning, without it affecting their grade? And some teachers will say, oh, hey, but hold on there. Putting points in the grade book, I need to give them points for homework and give them points for classwork and give them points for participation and so on. That's real world. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is I'd like to encourage you to stop telling your students that you're preparing them for the real world, because it perpetuates the stereotype that what we do in our classes is artificial. If I am working with authentic documents and my students are working with authentic documents as often as possible, my students are interacting with speakers around the world of the target language. If we are driving our instruction based on proficiency and communication, our classes are real world. That's a whole nother talk. So if we are going to tell our students that we're preparing them for life, work, and citizenship in a global society, then we need to be realistic about what that means outside of our walls. And what that really means is that for athletes and for musicians, they practice for hours. Many of them practice several hours a day. And the athletes fall, and they make mistakes in their technique. And the musicians also make mistakes in their technique, and they mess up their timing. And then the performance comes, and there's no score. When they get the score for their performance, it doesn't say, okay, so that skater got like this really great score. Oh, but now there's a deduction because she fell last week. That's not noted there. All we really want to see is what the person can do now. And take it into the work world. Doctors and lawyers have to pass a rigorous exam in order to start their careers. But a lot of them take the test the first time and fail it. What do? They go back, they study, they learn, they relearn, they try it again, and they pass it. And when they get their certification that will allow them to start their careers, it doesn't say, this person is certified to practice law, but you should know they failed the test the first time. That's not what the real world actually is. So I'd like to challenge you to, instead of communicating points when you grade your students, focus on proficiency. And we're going to see a couple of ways. Now, none of these gradebook slides you're going to see are actually my gradebook. For purposes of ease of what we're going to do, I'm going to look at gradebooks that look more like what all of us are used to. So with this student has a B right now. If we use traditional parameters, we look at everything that's in the gradebook, the student has a B. If we look at just what the student has shown they know and can do on assessments, the student has a C. Which one is a more accurate reflection of what the student has proven he or she knows and can do? And this student might be getting a grade that's higher than what he or she has shown that he or she knows and can do. But what about the opposite? The opposite also happens. These two students, just looking at their assessments, clearly know what they're doing. They have solid A's if you use the traditional measures. When you look at everything, student A only has 72%, 2 whole letter grades below. And in most grading systems, the teacher is going to record the C and say, hey, this student got a C in the class. And it doesn't matter that on all their assessments, they actually completely know what they're doing. And student B lost a full letter grade. Are we communicating points or are we communicating proficiency? I think what students need is not 100 shades of gray full of points. What they really need is 4 distinct colors that reflect what they know and can do. Are they approaching standard, meeting standard, exceeding standard, or not meeting standard? That I can describe in terms that parents can understand and in terms that students can understand. So you might be thinking, well, wait, all right, you talked a little bit about practice and about, not doing points for practice. Do students still practice? Do I still record the practice? Do you still grade the practice? And the answer is yes, yes, and kind of yes. So practice is essential to learning. We know that. We owe our students that. We have an obligation to ensure that our students have opportunities to practice and build the skills that will allow them to be proficient in situations beyond our classroom walls. And we need to document that practice. I have ways to document it so that my parents and students can see what it is they've done to build their skills without it affecting their grade. But I still document all the things that we do. But when it comes to grading, I want to encourage you to talk about feedback. Give your students meaningful feedback. I do collect a lot of practice. I don't put a grade on it, I put feedback on it. Where did we do well? Where are you struggling? And what steps can you take to make some improvement towards meeting proficiency or increasing in your proficiency to the next level? So looking at this, there's a lot here. We're looking at all kinds of parts of our grade system and thinking about changing it. There's a lot of steps that have to happen. I don't want any of you going home saying, okay, that's it, Monday morning, we're done here. We're gonna do all this all different. There's a lot that has to happen. Just thinking about it is the first step. I would encourage you to look at different grading categories if you're not already doing so. Instead of homework, classwork, quizzes, extra credit, tests, projects, and so on, let's look at categories like listening, speaking, reading, writing, or the actful modes: interpersonal communication, presentational speaking, presentational writing, interpretive listening, interpretive reading, interculturality. Categories that actually tell me something about what students have shown that they know and can do in the language. Let's develop a repertoire of strategies that allow us to give meaningful feedback to our students in the practice phase so that they actually have the opportunity to not just perform well in assessments, but actually have all the support they need on their way there to get there. Now, this one's a big one. We're going to need a cultural shift. Guess what? I was used to a culture of points, so are your students. Your students are used to a culture of points. So it's really important to actually start a cultural change by which you don't collect everything, by which we do some of the practice because it's helpful. And when your students start to see that the practice is meaningful and that the practice is helping them do well, they actually don't insist on it being for points. It has been 2 years since my students asked me, how much will this be worth and will this be on the test? The culture change can happen. And as we're getting there, we then look at our assessments and realize, the chapter tests that came with my publisher created materials maybe aren't really so proficiency oriented. I don't know, outside in the real world, I don't do a lot of conjugating of verbs. So it's time to shift to performance assessments that are authentic representations of what students do with language outside of our classes. Performance assessments that can be evaluated using rubrics like the ones provided by ACTFL and other organizations that are not 100 shades of gray, but 4 distinct categories that we can all actually describe and justify and explain why this student has an A and why this one has a B. But when you do that and you eliminate, for example, the practice points, you do need to know that your gradebook collapses into very few grades. There's very little in the gradebook. And so when that happens, the other thing that you have to have in place before you can totally transform this culture and move away from it all being about points to being about proficiency is that students, like lawyers and doctors, need the opportunity to have retakes. It's not, their grade shouldn't be about, ooh, too bad you didn't know it in October, but you know it now. That F that about not knowing in October, yeah, it's still there. Their grade should be about what they've shown they know and can do now. If they struggled in October and they know it better now, their grade should reflect that. It's not about the past. So looking at having a system of retakes where students can come in and get support, students can come in and get the practice that they need, grow their skills, and have a reassessment to have another chance to show that their proficiency has actually grown is meaningful for them. Why keep trying if I got an F in October on something when I know that even if I know it now, I won't be able to get a grade that shows that I know it? Why bother continue trying? It's a critical piece of the system. All of these steps take time, and some of them will feel really scary at first. And they're not happening everywhere. But we know when we talk to teachers and ask them what they really want for their students, we get answers a lot like this. These answers came from an institute I attended this past summer. And these were language teachers, and they said, here's what I want for my students. And they're all about culture and communication and global readiness and interculturality and understanding. They're not about conjugating in the subjunctive, getting 100%, doing all of the homework points. So deep down, we know that students don't need the cushions that we might think we've been providing. Deep down, we know that a 100% scale is 100 shades of gray. Deep down, we know that homework categories like homework, practice, quizzes, tests don't give us meaningful information. And putting points in those categories doesn't really give students a cushion that results in meaningful grades, but instead inflates the grades and creates a grading bubble. Deep down, we know that if we don't want to litter the path to proficiency with students we've lost along the way, as Greg Duncan said, then everything about our practice, including our grading practices, must be about proficiency and not about the points. It's time to burst the grading bubble. Thank you.